Imagine a world without cities, without electricity, without safe shelters. A world where every day was a battle to stay alive. In that brutal setting, humans emerged who managed not only to survive, but also to thrive. They were the pioneers of modern humanity. And among them was a group that left a mark as clear as the ice that surrounded them. And among them was a group that left a mark as clear as the ice that surrounded them. That group is known today as the Cro-Magnons. They were not creatures of legend or mythological figures. They were real people, our direct ancestors who inhabited Europe almost 570 years ago. Despite living on a continent dominated by cold, scarcity, and competition with other human species like the Neanderthals, they managed to impose their presence with a unique combination of intelligence, strength, and adaptability. And the most striking thing is that if you could look them in the eyes today, you might not notice much of a difference. But when you look more closely, Cro-Magnon is not just another name in the history books. Today's scientists know them as the first modern humans of Europe, or simply EEMH for its acronym in English. And they don't just say this intuitively, they say it because there's a whole list of clear anatomical characteristics that betray their tall, robust bodies, rounded brains, completely upright posture, flat faces without any pronounced protuberances, brow ridges as thin as twigs, and a defined chin that anyone would notice instantly. And most shocking of all, we have all those characteristics. The connection becomes even more evident when you analyze their bone structure. It's like looking at yourself in an antique mirror. Their skeletons almost perfectly reflect the modern human body. In fact, if you had accidentally wandered into Europe during the Ice Age, you probably would have thought you had come across someone living in your town, not a primitive being like the Neanderthals, who had a much more unusual appearance. Sure, you'd still feel like there was something off about them, because the Cro-Magnon weren't people you wanted to mess with. Physically they were like life-size action figures, muscular, strong, ready to fight if necessary. It is therefore not surprising that scientists initially thought they were a completely different species. One of the things that most caught the attention of the Cro-Magnon was their size. They were literally the giants of their time. The remains found show that women were on average about 1.63 m tall, and men were over 1.75 m tall, taller than today's global average. And that's not all. Some Cro-Magnon groups, especially those from Eastern Europe, were even taller, between 1.78 and 1.88 m. If we put them together today as a country, they would have the highest population on the planet. Skeletons have even been found of men who were up to 1.9 m taller than many NFL players. And be careful, they were not only tall, they were also strong, very strong. Although their bones had the same basic structure as ours, their bodies were much more solid. They had wider, thicker, and heavier bones, especially in the shoulders and legs. A good example is the clavicle. It measured on average about 19 centimeters, 25% longer than ours. And that's not just a curious fact, it means they could throw punches with brutal force. The physical build of the Cro-Magnon also reveals something clear. In life they were incredibly muscular. Some studies have shown that if we were to compare an adult Cro-Magnon with a modern person of the same height, the former would be approximately 20% heavier, and much of that extra weight would be pure muscle. This level of strength and robustness was neither accidental nor excessive. It was an essential adaptation for survival in Middle Ages Europe, where every day was a battle against extreme cold, dangerous animals and harsh environmental conditions. Being resilient wasn't an advantage, it was a necessity. Furthermore, fossils support this idea. Many skeletons show signs of having survived severe illness and injury. For example, in the same rock shelter of Cro-Magnon, several individuals with signs of infection have been found. Furthermore, a good portion of them had fused neck vertebrae, a condition likely caused by repeated traumatic injuries. One of the most shocking discoveries about the Cro-Magnon comes from the analysis of the remains of an adult female. His skull showed a considerable fracture, clear evidence that at some point he suffered a fairly severe blow to the head. The most surprising thing is that he survived for so long after the accident, as the bone had begun to regenerate, something that only happens when there is an active healing process. And if that's not enough to give us an idea of how difficult those lives were, the case of the first identified Cro-Magnon individual, known as Cro-Magnon 1, makes it abundantly clear. His skull and face were marked by multiple injuries, not caused by violence, but by a genetic disease that caused cysts and tumors throughout his body. Despite everything, he managed to reach adulthood, which is saying a lot, and according to analysis of his remains, he reached an advanced age by the standards of his time. Of course, in those days you didn't have to reach 80 to be considered elderly. Life expectancy for Cro-Magnons rarely exceeded 40 years. Something very similar to what is observed in Neanderthals. Extreme environmental conditions, disease, accidents, and animal attacks made dying young almost the norm during the Ice Age. So while we sometimes think of our ancestors as strong and heroic figures, which they were, it's also true that life in that era was brutal, short, and full of challenges from day one. Having a strong, compact body not only helped them survive harsh life conditions, it was also key to moving through difficult terrain and hunting large animals more efficiently. And we're not talking about small dams. Remains found reveal that Cro-Magnons used to focus on hunting huge animals such as wild horses, reindeer, bison, aurochs, ibex, and even woolly mammoths. Yes, those giants that impress even in documentaries. In fact, frozen carcasses of these animals have been found with pre- and post-mortem wounds, clearly caused by human tools. This tells us that these humans were not just opportunists, they were expert hunters. And they weren't just going after easy prey, they were also facing the dominant predators of the time. There is evidence that leopards, foal and os also fell victim to their weaponry, particularly spears made of stone and bone. Curiously, many of their prey are now extinct. Some have disappeared locally, like the European elephants, while others, like mammoths and aurochs, no longer exist anywhere on the planet. In several cases, it is believed that the human household played a role in these extinctions, and their weapons were not limited to simple spears. The Cro-Magnon mastered an impressive array of ranged and melee attack tools. Atlatels, throwers of spears, javelins, clubs, blades, nets, boomerangs and even, according to some theories, primitive bows. Each weapon had multiple variants, some with specialized tips, others with adapted handles. It was a very sophisticated art of war. But unfortunately, that technology was not always used against animals. Like us, the Cro-Magnons could also be violent towards each other. Remember the skull fracture we mentioned earlier? Well, it wasn't an isolated case. Head injuries were surprisingly common, and several of them appear to have been inflicted by other humans. One of the clearest examples is that of Cro-Magnon Sigund, an individual who lived more than 30 years ago, had a serious wound on the front of his face. Based on the nature of the injury, investigators believe he was struck with a blunt weapon, slow but powerful, which did not kill him immediately, but did doom him, as he died before he could heal. The scan shows signs of intracranial hemorrhage and brain hematomas, and he is not the only one. Other shattered skulls indicate that the head was the preferred target in many fights. Although there were also fatal attacks on the body, such as Sanjaruno, who received a deep cut to the thoracic vertebrae, enough to instantly cut off blood flow to the brain. The violence of that time was probably intensified by the extreme environment. The fights could have been over territory, food, mates, or resources. And although today we joke about fighting over the last taco, for them things were much more serious and dark. There is evidence to suggest that in some cases the human victims were not just killed, they were consumed. Human skull fragments dating back about 15 years were found in Gough's cave in England, apparently used as drinking or eating bowls. But the most chilling thing is that in that same cave, remains with clear signs of cannibalism were found. The bodies were dismembered, their muscles, tendons and bone marrow were removed with stone knives, and the bones were gnawed. Worse still, 2 of the 3 victims were children. This reminds us that although they were modern humans, they did not always act humanely. And to close this darker side, there is a case that involves not the Cro-Magnons directly, but their close cousins, the Neanderthals. Both groups coexisted in Europe for thousands of years. Although violence is not believed to have been the primary cause of the Neanderthal extinction, conflict is suspected. One of the most Intriguing cases is that of a Neanderthal with a fatal wound in the ribs, apparently caused by a stone-pointed weapon due to the direction of impact and the low kinetic energy. It is believed that it was a projectile thrown from a distance, and since Neanderthals did not use such weapons, but the Cro-Magnon did, the most likely conclusion is that he was killed by one of them. But that's not all. A Neanderthal jawbone was also found with cut marks almost identical to those left by Cro-Magnons when processing deer. The technique was so similar that many scientists believe the Neanderthal's body was used as a food source. Now, it should be made clear that none of this is conclusive. The jawbone found could have been used as a trophy or ritual element and not necessarily as food. Furthermore, although the cut marks have human characteristics, that does not guarantee that the Neanderthal was killed. He may have already been dead when he was prosecuted. And although there were violent encounters between Cro-Magnons and Neanderthals, most interactions between the two groups appear to have been quite normal. In fact, thanks to genetic analysis, we now know that they interbred. The clearest evidence for this comes from the early Cro-Magnon, who appear to have had closer ties to Neanderthals. One of the most fascinating examples is an individual known as OAS1, who lived about 40 years ago. His DNA shows that about 9% of his genetic heritage was Neanderthal, indicating that one of his great-grandparents, or even great-great-grandparents, directly belonged to that other human species. This high percentage has led some researchers to suggest that early Cro-Magnons had certain physical features reminiscent of Neanderthals. For example, some ancient skulls show a flatter back, with a bony protuberance at the nape of the neck, very similar to that seen in Neanderthals. Over time, many of these characteristics, reminiscent of Neanderthals, disappeared, as did the high proportion of genes inherited from them. Little by little, other features that made the Cro-Magnon unique also softened, such as their robust body structure. These changes appear to be related to the last Ice Age, a period that caused significant habitat loss and subjected these communities to extremely harsh conditions. Still, they retain some distinctive features such as relatively solid jaws and skulls. Their larger heads housed fairly developed teeth that probably helped them process tough, resistant foods. Their diet included not only meat, but also nuts, seeds, and roots that were difficult to chew, requiring a firm, efficient bite. But beyond the powerful teeth and sturdy skulls, there was something even more fascinating inside those enormous heads, the brain. And the surprising thing is that the Cro-Magnons had brains even bigger than ours. On average, their cranial capacity reached 1,514 cm superscript 3, while the current average is around 1,350. This difference in volume was mainly due to the expansion of the occipital and frontal lobes, which in them were noticeably longer and are related to key functions such as vision, reasoning, and decision-making. Of course, we don't know for sure how that size influenced their behavior or cognitive abilities. But what we can assume based on the evidence is that they were at least as intelligent as us. In fact, they are attributed 5 distinct cultures that encompass nearly 40 zeros: Aurignacian, Grabitian, Solutrean, Epigrabitian and Magdalenian. Each left impressive traces in the form of tools, art, structures and customs. Their intelligence is also reflected in how they used those tools. It wasn't just what they made, but how they applied it. For example, they developed collective housing strategies that took advantage of megafauna migrations, guided herds toward cliffs or bodies of water where it was easier to kill them en masse, and in the off-season they knew when and where to fish, making the most of natural cycles. It is even believed that some communities guide their flocks by establishing mobile camps so they have food always nearby, without the need for long journeys. And although plants don't scream or defend themselves like animals, they also sense the ingenuity of the Cro-Magnons. These humans learned to process and utilize a huge variety of plant foods. Today we know that they included at least 150 different types of seeds, fruits, nuts and starches. And if that were not enough, everything points to the fact that they were also the first to domesticate the dog. Several remains of Paleolithic dogs have been found in contexts associated with Cro-Magnon, like a specimen from 36,000 years ago found in Belgium. Another very revealing case is that of a 15-year-old dog that was buried next to a man and a woman. A clear sign that these animals were already a fundamental part of their lives, probably as house companions and camp guardians. And speaking of camps, the Cro-Magnons were not far behind. Sometimes they lived in caves, but they also built open-air dwellings. Huge cabins made mostly from mammoth skulls and bones. They were then covered with grass or animal skins to create insulation and primitive bedding. Many of these homes included an indoor fireplace and work areas, which made perfect sense. We had to stay productive. Even during an ice age, the distribution of space varied depending on the size of the dwelling. The smaller ones tended to be simpler, without divisions, while larger ones had clearly defined sections, areas for cooking, sleeping, warming the body, and processing meat. In many of them, remains of interior fires have been found, indicating that fire was essential to sustaining life. But not everything happened inside the cabins. The camps were organized logically, dividing areas for different functions. And even more interestingly, many communities created alternative camps to move around seasonally and thus make better use of the environment without wearing it down. Although these groups were usually small, no more than a few dozen people per settlement, that did not mean living in isolation. On the contrary, they maintained frequent contact with other groups through trade, and it was not just any casual exchange. Evidence has been found of trade routes covering distances of more than 200 km, exchanging essential materials that for some were a matter of life or death, especially during the last glacial maximum, when the climate became even more hostile. The fact that the Cro-Magnons lived in one of the harshest environments known to mankind did not prevent them from enjoying the finer aspects of life. Thanks to trade between settlements, we know that they shared not only tools and resources, but also art, clothing, and even jewelry. Art in particular seemed to have a special place in his world. They literally wore it on their skin. They used pigments, especially red ochre, to decorate their torsos, faces, and limbs. The designs ranged from simple dots to more complex figures of animals or humans. They also practiced tattoos, scarifications and piercings, although to a lesser extent, probably due to the risk of infection. And of course, they were renowned cave artists. Some of the world's most impressive cave paintings were made by them, such as those found in the famous Chauve Cave in France. Their favorite subjects were animals, lions, deer, mammoths, horses, aurochs, and bison, but from time to time they also drew strange figures, hybrid beings that combined human and animal features. And if we're talking about human parts, the Cro-Magnons seem to have a curious fixation on certain specific areas like the genitals. Have you heard of Venus? These small statuettes with exaggerated feminine forms were their work, and they were made for thousands of years. But if erotic art isn't your thing, don't worry. They also knew how to entertain themselves with music. They were not the first humans to play instruments, but they are believed to have taken music to a new level of complexity for their time. As with their weapons, their instruments varied in form and function. Flutes, whistles, drums, ediphones, and even bullers, an ancient instrument that spins and produces a deep hum, have been found. These objects allowed them to create an astonishing variety of sounds and probably songs. In fact, archaeologists believe we only know a small part of their musical history, because it is highly unlikely that they developed such sonic sophistication out of nowhere without a long prior journey. You're curious what his music sounded like? Well, one of the instruments they've been able to reconstruct is a flute made of bone, and it sounds more or less like this. Not bad for a civilization that lived in the middle of the Ice Age, don't you think? Seeing how they coped with the brutal cold of the Ice Age, one thing becomes clear. The Cro-Magnons not only survived, they won. And then the question arises, where did they go? The answer is not a great migration or a tragic fall. They stayed, they adapted while other human species disappeared. They continued to fight, love, and live until they became the dominant population of Europe after the Ice Age. There was a time when more than 70 Cro-Magnon roamed the continent, a huge number for that time. And although their cultures, from Aurignacian to Magdalene, are history today, their mark lives on. Unlike Neanderthals or Denisovans, the Cro-Magnons did not become extinct, they mixed with new peoples and became us. Maybe we only carry a small fragment of his DNA today, but his legacy is everywhere. In the painted caves, in the stone tools, in the bones of dogs buried with their owners, in the flutes that have still been playing for 30 years. The Cro-Magnon never left, they transformed, they stayed within us, and perhaps every time we create something, a song, an idea, an image, that creative spark that is born is the Cro-Magnon in us, awakening once again. In a way that resembled small, functional villages. Each area had a purpose, some for preparing food, others for making tools, tanning hides, or crafting weapons. Even waste zones existed, often a little distance away to avoid contaminating the living quarters. This level of organization shows that Cro-Magnon communities weren't just bands of survivors, they were planners, builders, and thinkers. They also had a deep appreciation for art and symbolism. Inside many of their caves, archaeologists have found stunning examples of cave paintings, mammoths, bison, horses, deer, vivid and dynamic images often painted in ochre, charcoal, and hematite. Some of these artworks date back over 30,000 years. But it wasn't just animals. They painted human hands, abstract symbols, and mysterious geometric shapes, hinting at a world of spiritual or ritual meaning we can only guess at today. They also carved figurines, often of animals or exaggerated human forms, especially the so-called Venus figurines, statues of women with pronounced features, possibly representing fertility, motherhood, or goddess worship. These artworks weren't just decoration. They served social, religious, and perhaps even political roles. Burial practices give us more insight. Cro-Magnons didn't just leave their dead behind. They buried them with care, often with tools, beads, ochre, and even flowers. This implies they believed in something beyond death, or at the very least, held deep respect and love for their kin. In some graves, entire families were buried together, wrapped in animal hides, surrounded by objects that spoke of their life and status. It's a hauntingly human touch, one that reminds us how similar they really were to us. And perhaps one of the most impressive legacies of the Cro-Magnons is their language. Though we can't hear it today, all signs suggest they spoke complex, symbolic languages. Their coordinated hunts, structured societies, and ability to pass down knowledge through generations wouldn't have been possible without sophisticated communication. Language may be the greatest inheritance they left us. In every way, the Cro-Magnons were us, just adapted to a more brutal, unforgiving world. They weren't monsters or myths. They were artists, parents, warriors, leaders. They faced unimaginable hardships, but they loved, dreamed, and created. And from their resilience, modern humanity was born. So next time you look in the mirror, remember, you're not just looking at yourself. You're looking at the echo of a legacy that stretches back tens of thousands of years. You're looking at Cro-Magnon.